Hey, Aboodi, thank you so much for joining us on this call. Such a pleasure having you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, Gaurav, and I look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. I waited for almost like a year and a half, chasing
Oh,
you and looking at where you are up to and making sure that you have some slot in your calendar. And I do appreciate that because the kind of work that you are doing with the Henley Business School and the other schools that you're a part of and your own practice, I'm sure that must be keeping you busy, and especially during these tough times.
well, up and down, like everybody else, I suppose. Sometimes I've been busier than others, but anyway, I'm glad that we finally connected, and I look forward to seeing where our conversation takes us.
Pleasure is all mine. Let's
Mm.
start with a very basic question.
Mm.
And I'm sure you would have answered that question some million times, if not more. How do you define coaching?
Ha, ha, ha. It's funny because I have answered that, or I don't think I've ever answered that question, but I've explored that question a lot.
Hmm.
And it changes all the time, my thoughts about this profession. I've been in coaching for 25 years, I think.
Yeah.
And I suppose I would say, I suppose I say this partly because I was in a conversation earlier today with someone about this, is that I think that I feel much less. It's not that I don't feel passionate about coaching. I still feel very passionate about coaching, but I'm very aware that maybe a few years ago, I might have talked in a very grand way about coaching and its capacity to change the world. And, the coaching profession has made many big promises. And I now suppose I think a lot of coaching is really, for me, about a space where people can come to help them navigate what is, for many people, a quite complicated and difficult life.
Hmm.
And in some ways, I suppose I would say that the promise of coaching is much smaller than I might have said it was a year ago. But I also think at the same time, and maybe slightly paradoxically, that perhaps it's more effective.
Hmm.
Because I think, and this is maybe a function of me getting older as well, I think, what people often need isn't magnificent, you can achieve anything type input. I mean, some people do, and that's fine. But I think a lot of people just need support and guidance and someone to listen to them and help them look at life a bit differently as they navigate what is for many people, and in a world that has a lot of difficulties about it. I live in Britain at the moment, and so we've got lockdown, and we've also got the whole conversations about Brexit and what kind of future we'll have, and we've got geopolitical issues in the world, and people are facing economic hardship, etc. So this idea that coaching is this magnificent thing that can help everyone achieve their dreams, it's that sort of thing that's just a bit outdated, and perhaps that's the dynamism of the profession, is that it isn't one answer because it changes over time, addressing concerns that people as individuals and collectively might be bringing.
Precisely. So considering these pandemic situation and the climate change happening and Black Lives Matter and so many socio-political, economic challenges the world is going through, if you were to define coaching today, considering the context that we are living in, which lens would you look at coaching from?
Well, I suppose, but I think one of the things that you mentioned is you mentioned areas of concern in the world. And I think that, so this isn't an answer to the question about definition of coaching, but I think it's something very important for the profession to think about, which is when I started coaching, there was a sort of purity about the profession, that coaches have no agenda. They're just there to serve the coachee with whatever she or he wants. And I think in some ways, one of the things that all of the things that you've mentioned, Black Lives Matter, climate change, the pandemic, the geopolitical things that we face in the world, is that coaching and individual coaches have to stand for something. We're not just automatons saying to a client, tell me what you want and I'll help you get there. There's something about being mindful of the world we live in, being mindful of the concern of Black Lives Matter, of climate change, so that we're not just, if you like, and this is being a bit simplistic, looking at growth without purpose. Maybe 20 years ago, coaching was very much of the growth without purpose. Even though it might talk about things like purpose, it was all inside a caveat of more, better, faster, smarter, moving forwards all the time. And I think now we're in a place of going, actually the world is in a pretty difficult place and there are concerns that have to be addressed, and more of the same isn't really an option.
I'm so much with you. I can resonate with every single word that you're saying, because I started my coaching practice almost a decade and a half back in the year 2006-07. And at that point in time, the only model that I was aware of, the Grow model by Sir John Whitmore. And I had the privilege of interviewing Sir John Whitmore at one point in time. And I'm sure had he been there in today's times, even he would have shifted his definition of coaching. because the context that we created, or Sir John Whitmore or Timothy Galway or Werner Erhard and all the likes of those people who started coaching in the early 80s or late 70s, the context was very different then than the context that we are living in.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And, I've often been reflecting. I mean, first of all, it's interesting that you mentioned all three of those people because, I think Werner Erhard in many ways was one of the progenitors of the coaching profession. And, I did the Landmark Forum, which was one of Werner Erhard's programs, and many coaches came from that tradition. John Whitmore worked closely with Werner Erhard, Galway did, ontological coaching, which you and I spoke about before the interview, has its roots in the works of people like Werner Erhard and Fernando Flores, etc. And I think it was a different time. And, that was the time of, we were exploring space, we were thinking about this great future, and science fiction was predicting all these amazing futures. And, if we look at that today, it seems like a very much more expansionist world where the world was full of possibilities. And now I don't think many people would be saying the world feels full of possibilities. It's become much more obviously about survival because of the pandemic, but it's also about climate change. It's also become about justice, which includes racial justice that you mentioned, but also gender justice, the Me Too movement, etc. So we're in a different kind of time. And I think the other thing that I've also been reflecting on, and many people have been speaking about, is that if you like, the period of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were very much, if you like, the foundations of a building of liberalism. And we saw many developments that we would now see as progressive. And in the last 5 years in particular, they have just been, cut back and cut back and cut back. And there's been a real attack, I think, on progressive values. And, in Britain, we talk about the culture wars and, this idea of an open world versus a closed world. And I think it feels like, that period of time had a very different flavor to it. Now we're in a much more difficult and challenging time.
Precisely. So, Aboodi, this is what actually brings me to another question. And my request is if you can just take a step back and look at as if we are watching a film, right? Where we are watching a film where the coaching for you started in the year early 1990s, right? For me, it started in 2000s. So both of us are watching this film and we see this complete zook in a flash, and we are standing in 2020 right now. What, according to you, is the common essence of coaching that you have been able to notice?
Well, I probably would say something like that, new professions don't arise out of nowhere. So the coaching profession developed to address concerns that existing practices could no longer address or weren't able to address fully. And at the same time, I think there's a rootedness in people looking for guidance. And if we go back before coaching and we go back, centuries, people would go and consult high priestesses or shaman for guidance, for, priests and rabbis and imams, and gurus for the sake of trying to figure out how to move effectively through a life. And, I wrote a review on a coaching book last year, and the premise of the book was, what's the point in coaching when we're all going to die? And in a sense, that has been human beings' inquiry for millennia. We are aware, the human being, I think, is the only species that's really fully aware of its own imminent demise. And that inquiry has always been there, ever since I think we became aware of that. I think that's what a lot of religious practices have been about, a lot of spiritual traditions have been about. And more recently, I think, as religions have declined or were declining in the second half of the 20th century, I think that people started to go, what is this life about? And then we became free of some of the more material concerns. It's like we've got a certain level of, Maslow's hierarchy, etc., that we've taken care of. Now what? And then I think the idea of designer lifestyles came along, and that became a bit of the fad of the early part of coaching, I think. But I suppose I'm rambling a little bit, but I think there is this common thread about people going, what do I do with this life?
Yeah. I mean, which is
about accumulating stuff or moving forward, or is there something else?
I mean, would it be a fair assumption to make, and I'm just hesitant to use the word purpose, I don't know what other word to use because I don't want to make it a little esoteric or abstract or spiritual in the
Yeah.
conversation. Would it be a fair assumption to make that, coaching can be a process that could assist or facilitate a, a journey for the other person to discover the why part of his or her life?
I think it could be. I absolutely think it could be, and I think it can and does do that. But I also think that it might be about meaning, which might be connected with purpose. And I also think, and this has also been one of my reflections, particularly this year, I suppose, is there's a quote from Joseph Campbell, and he says, "We don't seek the meaning of life; we seek the experience of being alive."
Hmm.
And I
Wow.
think that that's been a sort of, a thing of what is it to be alive? What does it mean to feel alive? And it's not necessarily about purpose. And if you think about, children, for instance, they're not concerned with the purpose of life and the
Yeah.
meaning of life. They're just, playing with their toys or arguing with their siblings or whatever, but they're fully in it. And, one of the things I've been exploring both for myself, but also as a phenomenon that's on the rise in the UK, people have been talking a lot about it, is the rise of cold water swimming.
Hmm.
And what a lot of people who go cold water swimming do is they say that freezing cold water gives them a really intense experience of feeling alive.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with purpose. Maybe the rest of their lives feel purposeless or just, going through the motions. But there's something about human beings, I think, that has that thing of just feeling alive, and I think that's also very important.
Wow, I think that's the simplest definition. I'm going to own it. I'm going to live by, and I'm going to share that with the world. That coaching is a process of holding the space for the other person, where the other person can actually experience the experience of being alive. Wow, thank you, thank you. So, Aboodi, my limited experience, and I know I'm talking to a master, the real masterful coach, Aboodi, right? I've had the honor of listening to you in several conferences. I've had the privilege of talking about you, the kind of learning that people have got from you, few of my common friends, and that's what we were talking about.
Yeah.
The initial part of my coaching journey, it was restricted to language. That the way you ask questions, the way you listen. And somehow, I personally believe that my body does not understand English. My body does not understand Spanish or French or Hindi or Urdu. So, what do you think? How at times language restricts a coach to hold that space for the coachee, where the coachee can experience the experience of being alive?
Well, that's a very rich question, Gaurav. And there's a quote that I often use when I talk about working with the body and coaching. It's a quote from James Joyce, the Irish novelist, and he wrote, "Mr. Duffy lived at a little distance away from his body." And I think we all live at a little distance away from our body. Some of us never go into our bodies.
Yeah.
Most of us live at a little distance away from our bodies. And I think there's something about a culture, and I mean you culture in the global sense, not in the sense of individual cultures, that has become very rationalist. So everything is about numbers and measurement and ROI, and it's tangible, and all of that lives in language. And I'm not saying that's not important, and in some fields like science, for instance, we absolutely need to be clear about numbers and coordinate with language, etc. But the lived experience, and if we go back to the child playing, it's not a linguistic act in the first
Absolutely.
place. It's a embodied experience of being alive, or an emotional experience of being alive. And the brain, the linguistic brain, is only one part of being human. But what I think we have done, and culture reinforces that, is to make that the dominant thing. So we talk about, for instance, getting over our feelings, or we don't pay attention to the body. We sit, just as a simple example, we sit in front of our laptops working away, and we forget that we need to pee, or we forget that we need to eat, and we're just immersed in whatever it is that's going on. And the body is like a little taxi to hold the brain while it works. And I think that we then miss out on something very important, both as human beings. If we're just in our heads, we miss out on the somatic experience, what our body has to tell us, the sense of being fully in the body, and the emotional thing. But also as coaches, if we don't pay attention to the somatic and emotional domains, then we miss, first of all, we miss so much of our client. We don't fully read them. But we also
Precisely.
miss the possibility for change. And you know that life isn't just about having an instruction book. If it was, then it'd be very simple, and we certainly,
I love
because we
it.
would just, here's the instructions for living. But
Yeah.
we are embodied beings, we are emotional beings. And I think that the coaching profession needs to address that. And it's beginning to. I mean, it's definitely better than it was when I started.
Absolutely. I just love it when you say that wish life could have come with an instruction book. We could have actually read that and then we would have lived it like never before. However, we call it human beings. Aboodi, here's one of the questions that I've struggled to explain. First, it took me a lot of time to understand and experience the being part of human being. And today I struggle to explain this concept of being to people. How do you explain this term called being of human being?
You know, I still struggle. I mean, I've worked in the field of ontological coaching for 10 or 15 years, and it is all about being. And I still struggle to do it. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote a paper on ontological coaching. And part of the reason I wrote that was because I'm still trying to figure out how to answer the question when people say, what is ontological coaching or what is being? And I don't think they're easy concepts. You know, and part of what's difficult about being, I think, is that we sort of take it for granted. Well, of course, I'm a human being. And yet, you know, one of the things about being that I think is tricky for us is that it's so obvious to us that it's invisible. And I think that part of coaching, and I sometimes say this, is that coaching is the blind leading the blind. It's not that I'm smarter than my clients or that my coach is smarter than me. It's that they're not blind the same way that I am. And the reason I say that at this juncture in the conversation, Gaurav, is that for me, you know, my being is invisible to me. Your being is invisible to you. But when I coach someone, if I have eyes and I'm paying attention to not just their language, but their emotions or the emotions that I feel when they speak and the somatic domain, I might notice things about the client that she or he doesn't notice about themselves, and vice versa. You know, I've got a lot of experience of coaching. I understand a lot about this profession. And yet when it comes to my own life and my own being, I'm just as blind as everybody else. And I need someone outside me to say, do you notice X? Or do you notice Y? And I go, I never even noticed that. So I think we are blind to our beings, not because we're ignorant or stupid or anything, but simply because I just live in this. And it's a little bit like, you know, if we live in a narrative, like we live in a country and a language, and then we discover that there's a different language. That's the first time that we realize, you know, that there is this being called being English, for instance, or speaking. We travel abroad and we go, they do things differently. And then suddenly I start to notice things that people take for granted.
Bang on. So I'm picking a few things here, Aboodi. One is we are blind, not about our being, but we are blind about our blindness as well. That's the first thing which I'm picking up right now. The second thing is, as I'm just talking to you, and when I asked you this question, that I struggle, and when I started to listen to you, how I realized that and that's a mistake that I have done, and I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. I make an attempt to explain being with my language. And I think that's itself is I'm not being able to create an experience that could allow the other person to experience the being part of it, because I'm using only one faculty, which is language, and I'm explaining something.
This is part of the challenge we have. You know, there's a paradox in this for me, is that you and I are speaking in language. Now, of course, we're communicating, we're smiling at each other and nodding, but we are using language because we live in language. And yet language is insufficient. But it's often the only thing that we have to explain ideas or concepts. And, you know, but also, you know, if we think about how we absorb information about the world, it's primarily, or about concepts, it's through language. We read papers, we read academic books, or we hear a lecture. And yet we're also learning emotionally and somatically. But if we want to explain a concept like what is being, it's very difficult to not use language to do that. And at the same time, as you point to, language is woefully insufficient to do the job. So we're in some paradoxical territory.
Yeah, yeah. Also, as I'm just listening to, and as much as I would love to share it with you, would want to hear your views on that. So would it be a fair assumption to say that I am blind to my being? At the same time, there's another being that I'm living in, the being of the culture or the context that I'm living in, which has been given to me from the culture that I'm a part of. Even that would have an impact on the way I show up. Because when I was listening to you and you said that it's a language, the moment you step onto some other territory or some other land, you realize that now I'm in Britain, I'm in the US. So, fair assumption?
And that makes me think a little bit about the nature nurture debate. So you bring some of yourself to this life, but some of yourself is also shaped by the narratives that you've been immersed in. So there's family. The family that we grow up in shapes us. It particularly shapes us emotionally, actually. We learn that certain emotions are okay, certain emotions are not okay, or we learn that all emotions are not okay. I mean, families have messages and narratives about emotions that we learn. We learn how to move through space. That different cultures, people in different cultures move differently. Some cultures are more animated and expressive with their hands and their bodies when they're speaking. Others are more contained. And we learn stories about the world through language. The American discourse that used to be the case of anyone can be president, this idea that anything is possible, that's a very American and Western narrative. My parents came from the Middle East, where one of the big things that you'll hear people say is inshallah, if God wills it. It's very different than you make your own luck. And all of these things that we pick up, and then they become us, and we go, well, that's just the way that I am. Not paying attention to that the way that I am is something that I've just been shaped all of my life by the different conversations and groups and organization and profession and cultural narratives and advertising and stories, etc., that have shaped me to be the person that's here in this moment.
So beautiful. And so we don't even notice what we are noticing. We don't even question the narratives that I've been born in and I've been living with.
Yeah.
And that actually drive our behavior. And then we question luck, we question Allah, we question universe, we question and blame the society that I'm a part of without realizing that it's me who's creating the results, whatever is there in front of me.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that last bit. I'm not sure that I'm creating results of what's in front of me, because I think that's also a narrative that we have. You create the world around you, rather than, I think it's more that even that interpretation is something that we've learned, because not everybody will see the world that way. And I think, again, we're in some very tricky territory, because this sounds very abstract as a conversation that we're having. It's like almost like two philosophers speaking about something. But I think the real thing to say, and this is where I think coaching has a part to play, is asking us, if you like, question that I sometimes, and I don't ask this necessarily to a client, but is informing coaching, is what history is speaking through a client? How did the client in front of me get to be the person who they are, that sees the world the way they do, that moves the way they do, that feels the way they do? And that's where if we can have that kind of curiosity, we can help someone unpick the things that they take for granted, that they don't even know because they're taking it for granted. And again, I don't say that to diminish anybody or to say that that's an insufficiency. That is to be human. I am blind to my own blindness, even though I know about blindness to blindness because I teach it and I work with it. I am still blind to my own blindness.
Yes. So, Aboodi, this brings me to the next question. I've experienced in myself that there's a tendency in me to live from my own past, from my own history. And I've experienced different kinds of different shades of resentment, resignation in my life. So let's say if you are coaching me and I'm operating from a space of resentment and resignation and blame and shame and, mistrust to the world or for the world, not being able to trust people so easily. So because I have a history to that, right? What can you do as a coach, or how can you show up as a coach that could allow me to recognize this, take the first step, take the second step, take the third step? Could be a possibility I might just slide back.
There are so many questions in there that I think are, or so many things in that question, Gaurav, that I think are worthy of highlighting. And I want to start with the last one, really, which is the thing about slipping back. Because I don't believe, and it goes back to what I said before, I think, about the shaping of the coaching definition. I don't think that coaching will change anybody's life. I don't think there's such a thing as a wake-up moment where you go, now I'm never going to slip back. I think it's very much more about we have an awareness and then we develop new practices and we have to keep those new practices going. So we talk about the past that has shaped us. You talk about it in a particular context of resignation or lack of trust or resentment. So the first thing we might do is to become curious. Where did you learn that? I learned not to trust because this happened when I was young, or I learned resentment because this happened. And I, grew up in a family that was always complaining about the government or blaming other people or whatever. That's the narrative that we've been sticking to. Great, good awareness. Then we think about how might we practice moving away from resentment, or what other mood might we practice? And if we use the example of resentment, and I speak as someone who lives in a country filled with resentment at the moment. I mean, the Brexit conversation has really opened up huge chasms of pain and resentment in the UK. And so I noticed that I could easily, I'm really anti-Brexit. I'm totally horrified at the decision that we've made. And when the decision was made in the referendum in 2016, I noticed I spent the first few weeks in deep resentment about it, reading newspapers, arguing, getting really involved in it. And in a sense, what I was doing, if we think about it in the context of what we're talking about, was continuing to practice the mood of resentment. And so one of the things that we might think about is, what conversations do we immerse ourselves in? I was immersing myself in conversations that were fueling the resentment about Brexit. Now, I'm not arguing about whether Brexit is a good thing or not. I'm saying that if I want to have a different mood, then I need to think about what conversations I do. Yeah. When I work with executives, for instance, who have resentment, one of the things that causes a lot of resentment or fuels resentment is gossip. We talk to our colleagues about what a jerk the boss is. Well, the boss might be a jerk. I'm not saying that they're not. But if I keep myself in those conversations about the boss being a jerk,
I'm only feeding into that.
Only feeding into it. So if I step out of those conversations and think about being in different moods, immersing myself in different moods, different conversations, like a conversation of gratitude, for instance. If I find a community of people, which may be a religious community or some other space, a spiritual community where people are practicing gratitude instead of resentment, for instance, I might start to top up the gratitude and the resentment might go down. But, and the important thing is, if I stop that new practice, the old habits will have me. My parents came to England in 1961, and they were in their late 30s. They'd lived in Iraq all their lives. So Arabic was their first language. And even after many years of practicing English, under pressure, if they were upset or they forgot a word or they were tired, Arabic would be the thing. And I don't think resentment or any other mood is any different than that. If I don't practice my good habits, then my old habits will win because I've just been doing them longer. I've spent 50 years being this kind of person. If I start practicing a new thing, so I meditate every day now and I am more calm than I used to be. It's a very fiery temper, like that. I don't practice meditation and other things like yoga that help me to feel calm and centered, then I notice I become a little snappier. So it's an ongoing thing. And I think this is really important, both in terms of, understanding how people are, but also in terms of the coaching thing. It's for coaching to really be clear that all it can do is help people to see the possibility of change. But the real work is consistent, regular practice.
Yeah. So awareness creates choices. Now it depends entirely onto you, the kind of practices that you would like to pick up and run with. Because, with coaching, you're not going to kill the past patterns which have been guiding your life. You're only going to tame them so that you can pick up new practices and you can create some different results for yourself. You can choose from a different options which are available to you. And the moment you're under stress, and that's where there's a tendency in people to get back to the reactive tendencies and the reactive behaviors.
And I think you've made a really important point here, which is really worth taking out and highlighting. You said coaching cannot kill past patterns. And I think in the past, coaching has made a promise that it can kill past patterns. You know, overcome your fear. No, you're never going to overcome your fear. And actually, you shouldn't, because sometimes we should be afraid. But it's not going to overcome and defeat something. It's going to bring an awareness that this is something that you have learned. You've learned to be resentful or mistrustful or fearful or whatever it is. Great. Now we know that. And we know that we're well practiced in that because we've got 20, 30, 40, 50 years of that. Now we have the possibility to practice something that, as you say, can help us tame something. And I think that makes coaching a more realistic proposition than saying you can kill your resentment or kill your fear.
Yeah. It's what I'm listening right now is whether it's resentment, it's fear, it's hatred, it's jealousy, all those emotions. And you are an expert, would love to hear your thoughts on the emotions because you do a lot of work in the space of emotions and coaching. We can only embrace them rather than looking at fear as something that I really hate, rather than creating another emotion, which is again unresourceful. First, I have got fear, and then I'm bringing hate as well. Again, this fear, rather than creating more hatred towards this fear. I'm just looking at this and then making a different relationship with fear, making a different relationship with resentment, making a different relationship with resignation. A fair assumption to make?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's true. We have to accept the emotions that we have, and that's not always easy. And you mentioned resignation, and I think resignation is a particularly difficult mood for coaches to be with. You know that coaching talks a lot about possibilities and choices, and if a client comes to coaching and says, I have no choices in my life, a lot of coaches really resist that. Oh, everybody has a choice, rather than being curious about how did the coachee learn that they have no choice. You know, and if you've gone through life and every time you've tried to extend into life, you've been knocked back and you've been knocked back and you've been knocked back for whatever reason, you are going to develop the narrative that you don't have a choice. And if coaching can't be curious about that mood, then all it's doing is telling someone who says, I am in resignation, you're wrong to be in resignation. And there's a terrible missing. And that happens with a lot of moods, but it happens particularly with resignation because the entire, if you like, the entire ontology of coaching is about helping people have more choice in life.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, in fact, this reminds me of a conversation long time back, some 7-8 years back. I was a part of the workshop. Somebody was leading this program, and this one of the fellow passenger, one of the fellow participant, he said, I don't think that I've got choices in my life. And the lead faculty said, hey, everyone has got a choice in life. And they got into the hornlock situation. And what happened because of that, this participant got up and left the workshop. And I was wondering, how else could this person handle this conversation as I'm just listening to you, rather than challenging the person of the narrative that he's operating from or the belief that he or she is operating from? How can we actually engage in a conversation with curiosity? That what history is he coming from? What narrative is she coming from? Why is he saying what he's saying, and what is the context that she's living in because of which she's making this loud statement?
And what that tells us, I think, is that the real work for the coach is to do the work on themselves so that they can be curious rather than lock horns, as you say. And that means ongoing work on themselves. You know, if a client is sad and I say to him, here, have some tissues, don't cry, I'm closing down the sadness rather than saying, what do those tears have to tell us? Be sad, it's okay. But I have to be comfortable with sadness in myself in order to do that with a client who is sad, or with anger or fear or resignation. A lot of inner work that we as coaches have to do. And I think, you know, this is part of the maturation of the coaching profession, because when it started, it didn't have any of that. And if I have a criticism of the work of Werner Erhard, is that they would, you know, Landmark would say, you know, emotions are something that you get over. They're obstacles to you being the possibility you can be in the world. And I think we've matured now to go, emotions are part of our history, and the coaching profession has to, and the ICF's core competencies have changed in order to acknowledge this. We have to be able to be comfortable and at peace with strong emotions in the coachee, which means being comfortable with strong emotions in ourselves. So there's this ongoing process of coaches. And you mentioned Sir John Whitmore earlier in our conversation. He said the difference between a good coach and a great coach, ongoing work on yourself. And I think that's so important for us as coaches, particularly at the moment when, clients are really struggling. We're all struggling to a sense of lockdown. And if a coach is like, no, then there's no possibility for real empathic work.
Yeah. So since we are talking about sadness, we are talking about emotions, right? As a coach, how can I leverage emotions for the benefit and the development of my coachee?
Well, I'm curious about what you mean by leverage, I suppose. That's my first reaction.
So, for example, how can I use that as the data for the other person so that she can look at that rather than denying it? I can look at that, explore that, and get some value out of this. How can I use this to grow as an individual?
So I suppose the first part of my answer or my thoughts about your question would be for you to be at peace with the emotion in the client. Because if you're not at peace, then it will get closed down. So, whether it's sadness or fear or resignation, etc. And then I think the second bit is just to bring curiosity. Like, I'm curious about what emotion you might be feeling. Or sometimes you might speak about something and I feel sad about it. And I say, when you speak about that, I feel sad. Does that resonate with you? So it's being very explicit about emotions. But then it's about, I think, saying to the client, and what might this sadness be telling you? We're so good at going, I shouldn't be sad. And, we use Prozac to medicate sadness rather than go, what does sadness have to tell us? And sadness tells us usually that we've lost something we care about. So we start to get curious. And if we welcome sadness into coaching, fear or an emotion, partly it allows the space for that to be more acceptable or accepted by the client. But also then it begins to go, I am affected by this. I am moved by this. And sadness has shaped me in this way. And it has this to tell me. And then I don't know where the conversation will go because it's different for each client. But there is something about that spaciousness that we give to that. Then allows us to move the conversation in a very different direction than going, let's close down the sadness.
Precisely.
The sadness might open up deeper questions for the client about her life or his life that the closing down wouldn't allow us to.
Yeah, I think that is where, on one hand, we are actually looking at the other person from the language perspective. You also spoke about the emotions perspective. What could be another dimension to look at so that the other person can tap into his being or her being?
Of course, there's the body, which we touched on briefly. And, being curious about the client's body and our body as we are in the conversation. So
tell me more about that.
Well, when the client is speaking, they're not just reporting words. They're just typing words out to us. There is a body that is speaking. And, we can be curious about how that body is moving as we're speaking.
How he or she is holding his body, the way he's breathing, the way he's holding the shoulders and all.
Exactly. I notice that when you talk about your boss, your shoulders go up around your ears. I'm curious about that. Or I notice that when you talk about your workload, I feel a tightness in my chest. I'm curious about that. We're bringing, again, you use the word data, and it's a funny word to use about stuff that isn't quantifiable, like emotions and somatics, but it's information. It's things that we notice. I notice that you look away when you talk about this person, or that your eyes soften when you talk about that person.
Wow.
These are things to be curious about so that our client can go, like an example I have is I was working with a client who had been promoted. He was a team member and then he got promoted to be team leader. And the issue that he brought to coaching was, I find it difficult to ask my team to do things. And they often don't take me seriously when I make a request. And all the time he was telling me this, he was giggling. And I said, do you notice that you're giggling? And he said, no, which isn't unusual. We don't notice our being, going back to an earlier part of the conversation. And anyway, and so I said, do you notice you're giggling? He said, no. And I said, is that how you are when you make requests of your team? And he said, yeah, because I want them to like me. I used to be a team member and I don't want them to think, oh, now he's the boss. He's become cold and, non-emotional or not warm and not one of the team anymore. And so there was a real awareness for him that his body and his way of being somatically wasn't giving the team any sense of his gravitas. And
Yeah.
then, if you like, the coaching homework or practices became about what would he do to build his gravitas so that he would be taken seriously when he needed to be taken seriously, which, for instance, was when he was making a request of his team or giving them some instruction about what needed to happen.
Wow, what an experience. And while I was listening, there were two words that came to my mind. One was gravitas, the second one is identity.
Yeah.
That how unconsciously I was getting stuck with an identity that I had, that this is how a boss should behave, and this is how a person should behave when he's dealing with or she's dealing with these colleagues who were his peers at one point
Yeah,
in time.
exactly.
So, yeah.
And identity, which you mentioned, is something we generate. You know, the way I show up generates an identity. So a leader walks into a room, for instance, and they've generated an identity by the way they walk, the way they move, the way they speak, you know, how they dress. All of it is part of an identity. And one of the things that I think coaching can help us with when we work at this being level is to start thinking about what is the identity that we generate. I'm a team member. I'm not a serious boss because I'm joking all the time. Versus what is the identity we want to generate, and how do
I
we have to
would want to
change
generate.
in order to generate a new identity? So if I want to
Yeah.
generate gravitas, I'm going to have to move and organize myself differently than if I wanted to generate a mood of a jovial team member. I might do both. I might want to be the team member who can go to the bar and hang out with his colleagues and have fun with them. And I might also need to generate the thing of, we need to get this report done by Tuesday and you better do it.
So help me understand. Now, if you were to create a connection, a relationship between being and identity, uh, how would we create that bridge?
That's a good question. Well, I suppose what it makes me think about is that there is an aspect of being or a part of being that we can change. And, you know, so some of it we can't change. It's sort of rooted in us, if you like. And some of it we can change. And the bit of it that we can change can allow us to generate different identity. So that, for instance, you know, if we have a group of friends and every time we call X, they have an excuse not to join us for the social event. Let's go to dinner. No, I can't make it. Let's go to lunch. No, can't make it. Eventually, we'll stop asking that person because they will generate a public identity that says this person isn't interested or available or able to commit. So we ask X that, they always say no.
Yeah.
So they've generated that identity. Now, we work with them as a coachee. They might say, I'm really lonely. I'm missing out on connection. And if we get curious about what they might have done to generate that, they might say, you know, I noticed that I turned down requests for social gatherings, etc. And then we might look at that and they might talk about the history that shaped them that way. And then we say, if you want to generate a different identity, if you want to change the loneliness, you're going to have to generate a different identity. It's going to be someone who starts to say yes to social invitations. Part of that might mean that they call all the friends and say, look, I'm sorry, I kept saying no. I'm now ready to change my identity. They may not use those words, but you know, I'm ready to develop something different. So I want to be re-included and I'm going to organize the first event as a way to start to initiate a new future based on me saying, I want to develop a public identity being someone who is available. Because I've recognized that the cost of not being available is that I end up being excluded from social invitations. So there's an identity part to it and there's a being part to it. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but those are the things that I think about how those two might interplay.
No, I'm absolutely with you. That I think it's helping me to adjust all these pieces and also look at that in case I would like to bring a shift in my being, there are certain things that I have to do on the practical surface level, which is very transactional in nature. It could be as simple as you mentioned, just picking up a phone and calling somebody. I might not be very comfortable. My body might not be supporting me. I might not be able to experience that embodied experience. And yet there's something that I need to be aware of, the mood that I've been operating from, the emotion that I've been holding. And then slowly and steadily, the being might get shifted. You said something really interesting, and I would love to get deeper into that. You said there are certain aspects of being you can change, and there are some aspects of being you cannot change. If you can just throw some more light on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I can't change my height. So there's things about my body that I can't change. I also recognize that the older we get, the more difficult it is to change things. So I'm never going to be fluent in Hindi. Even if I spent the rest of my life living in New Delhi and only being in Hindi-speaking environments, I'll always have an accent for a start. I may never pick up the vocabulary. So I suppose, again, part of this goes back to this thing about, the early coaching promise was you can change everything, nothing is impossible, no limits. That's not true.
Yeah.
There are things we cannot change. I'm nearly 50. I'm not suddenly going to have the body of a 20-year-old, much as I might like it. So there's some, if you like, physical limitations or physical things that we don't change. I'm not going to
or those deep-rooted, I'll not say issues, I'll say deep-rooted relationship that you have actually built, psychological relationships I'm talking about during the formative years. It would always have a shade in everything that you'll be doing or saying or the way you'll be showing up. It would always have a shade. You might be able to camouflage it. You might be able to, or you might be able to make something else more dominant, and yet the dominant part would always be there. A fair assumption to make?
Yeah, I think that's true. And it goes back to what we were speaking about before when we spoke about moods and resentment and fear, etc. Is that we'll tame it, we won't kill it. So, someone who's spent 40 years in resentment or grew up in trauma, for instance, in a traumatic family, for instance, they're always going to be affected by that. But we can tame the effects of it. But we can't suddenly magic that person will have had a happy childhood where they form secure emotional attachments. And there's a really interesting book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he talks about how if a child has poor attachment, for instance, then they may always walk away from any challenge because that's, a function of poor attachment, insecure attachment. Well, we often meet clients, for instance, who find it difficult when they are challenged. If we have an understanding of that possibility that trauma and insecure attachment might shape them that way, then it becomes something about recognizing, I'm not going to change my early attachment. We can't. I mean, that's an ontological truth, if you like. But we can start to think about how do we tame its effects on us. That might mean doing some deep therapy work, or it might simply be becoming more aware of how we're being stopped and beginning to explore how might we start to explore this a little bit. But recognizing that the shaping will not become something that we ever kill or overcome completely.
One of the common themes which is emerging here is, Aboodi, you can't kill it, you can tame it. So that's a common theme which is emerging here.
I think that's true, actually. And it's really interesting because, obviously I talk about these things quite often, but I think it's really nice to have a conversation that allows me to come to different ways of articulating it. And I think you can't see it, but you can tame it. It's actually quite a nice way to sum up the possibility for change that human beings have, because I don't think it's true to say that we can't change and that we're doomed forever. But I equally don't think it's true, and coaching used to say this, that we can overcome everything and anything is possible. I think it's more honest and realistic and perhaps more of a business proposition to say you can't kill it, but you can tame it. And what practices will help you, the coachee, to tame the history that you've been, or the effect of the history that you have been given.
I think that has been a great conversation, Aboodi. Thank you so much. And Aboodi, if you were to go back in your life and start your coaching practice again, what would you do differently?
Oh, God. So many things come to mind. I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, honestly. What would I do differently? I don't know, actually. I mean, I feel a bit, what's the word? Not stumped by the question, but certainly like it's caught me short, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to it.
Something to explore, both for you and for me.
Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. Now, let's say if you were to give a piece of advice to a young coach, what would that be?
Well, there's a quote that Jung said that I use in my teaching. And he said, learn your theories and techniques as well as you can, and then be prepared to set them aside when you meet the miracle of the living soul in front of you. And when I run courses for coaches at any level, I teach, master classes, but I also train new coaches. One of the things that I love to hear, and I usually hear at least one or two people say it at the end of each course, is you've allowed me to feel okay with coaching the way that I want to coach, not the way the books say I have to coach. So the advice would probably be something like coach unplugged. Like, this idea that we have to be a certain kind of way or, adapt ourselves in this sort of way inhibits us a lot. And one of my favorite writers is a guy called Irvin Yalom, who wrote a lot of books about psychotherapy. And he said that a therapist has to invent a new therapy for each client session. And that's some of that. I mean, I think coaches have to do that too. It's this idea of forget everything that we've learned. Of course it's important. I'm not saying we shouldn't learn about coaching in models and methodologies, but forget all of that. It's like, what happens when you are there with the person? What does your instinct tell you? What does your body tell you? What do your emotions tell you? And that, for me, is when I listen to coaches coaching and I work with coaches and help them develop. It's finding that bit of us that is, if you like, a pure coach, because it's natural. And even, none of us get there most of the time. But that would be the thing, is to just think about how do we get more of that?
I think, thank you so much for putting it so beautifully that you need to invent a new coaching for every new client of yours. So thank you so much, Aboodi. Thank you so much for your time. I think it was an amazing conversation. Great learning for me.
Thank you.
Loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.